cops knew who I was. I left prints everywhere, and they covered it up and let me kill the rest of those guys to turn me into a serial killer.
I sentence you to death for the murder of Charles Humphreys.
Yeah, your wife and kids get
I sentence you to death for the murder of David Spears.
You sabotaged my ass society. A raped woman got executed and was used for books and movies and shit. Bladder climbs, the election, everything else. You're an inhumane bunch of f***ing living bastards and bitches, and you're gonna get your asses nuked in the end.
Aileen Wuornos. On the highways of Florida in the late 1980s, truck drivers and travelers passed around a warning. A woman. Hitchhiking. Something wrong about her. She wasn't just another drifter. She was something the criminal profiling community had almost no template for. Aileen Wuornos would become one of the very few women in American history to be classified as a serial killer, and her case would raise questions about self-defense, exploitation, trauma, and the justice system that still don't have clean answers. To understand what Wuornos became, you have to understand what she was given. She was born in 1956 in Rochester, Michigan, and the architecture of her life was broken from the very beginning. Her father was a convicted sex offender who hanged himself in prison. Her mother abandoned her before she turned 5. By the time she was 11 years old, Aileen was trading sexual favors at school for cigarettes and food. She was a child. That is what was happening to her. By 14, she was pregnant, the result of being raped by a friend of her grandfather. The baby was put up for adoption. Shortly after, she was thrown out of the house and left to survive entirely on her own in the woods of Michigan. She slept in abandoned cars. She begged for food. She was a teenager with nowhere to go and no one looking for her. That experience, that specific, prolonged, unsupported abandonment, forged a person who had learned one foundational lesson. The world is predatory, and the only way to survive it is to be predatory first. By her 20s, Wuornos had drifted to Florida. She supported herself as a sex worker along the highways, standing at roadsides, offering companionship to men passing through. Most drivers saw what they expected to see. None of them suspected what was coming. Between 1989 and 1990, Aileen Wuornos murdered at least 7 men. Her method was, in structural terms, simple. She would engage men under the guise of paid sex, and at some point during or after, she would pull out a gun and shoot them. She robbed them. She took their vehicles. She disappeared back into the sprawl of Florida's highway network. Each body was found in remote areas, shot multiple times, stripped of valuables, left in conditions that slowed identification. When police finally connected the cases and she was apprehended, her explanation was one that divided everyone who heard it. She did not deny the killings. She had never denied them. What she denied was the characterization of herself as a predator. She claimed, consistently, and with a specificity that gave some investigators pause, that every man she killed had attempted to rape her, that she was acting in self-defense, that she was a woman doing what she had done her entire life, surviving a world that was trying to destroy her. The prosecution's counter-argument was built on the cold efficiency of the pattern. The robberies, the stolen vehicles, the repetition, the way each killing followed the same operational template. This, they argued, was not a woman defending herself. This was a woman who had developed a system. Both arguments were probably, to some degree, true, and the legal system was not designed to hold both of them simultaneously. What made Wuornos genuinely unforgettable, beyond the crimes themselves, was her behavior in court. Most criminal defendants, regardless of guilt or innocence, are coached to present as calm, controlled, remorseful. They sit quietly. They listen. They answer questions in measured tones. Wuornos did none of this. She exploded. She screamed at judges. She hurled profanity at juries. She turned to cameras and prosecutors and delivered tirades that the national media could not stop airing. At one point, in one of the most quoted moments of her trials, she shouted that she had killed those men in cold blood. The courtroom went silent. Viewers at home watched a woman who seemed, in that moment, to be confirming every worst thing that had ever been said about her. But the picture was more complicated. In the course of her adult life, Wuornos had one meaningful relationship. A woman named Tyria Moore, whom she met in a Daytona Beach bar in the mid-1980s. They became, by all accounts, genuinely attached to each other. Wuornos supported them both financially. Moore was the closest thing to family she had ever had. After Wuornos' arrest, investigators offered Moore full immunity in exchange for cooperation. Moore agreed. Under law enforcement direction, she made a series of recorded phone calls to Wuornos. On those calls, Wuornos confessed, in detail, repeatedly, and with an explicit statement that Moore had nothing to do with any of it. She was protecting the one person she loved. Those recordings became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Moore later testified against her in court. In 1992, Wuornos was convicted of 6 murders and sentenced to death. Over the following decade on Florida's death row, she descended deeper into paranoia. She made accusations that were increasingly disconnected from verifiable reality. Claims about prison guards poisoning her food, claims that law enforcement had allowed her to keep killing in order to profit from her story, claims about sonic weapons being used against her. Whether this was genuine mental deterioration, the result of years of isolation, or something else, nobody ever fully resolved. On October 9, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at the Florida State Prison. Her final words, delivered to the witnesses assembled to watch her die, were this: "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day, with Jesus. June 6th, like the movie, big mothership and all. I'll be back." Then the chemicals entered her bloodstream, and she was gone. Her story did not end there. Documentaries. Books. The 2003 film Monster, in which Charlize Theron's portrayal of Wuornos won the Academy Award for Best Actress. The case has been analyzed, debated, and relitigated in academic and journalistic settings for more than 3 decades. Was she a monster who preyed on men she had lured and robbed? Was she a broken woman who had been failed by every system and every person who should have protected her, lashing out at the only available targets with the only tools she had ever been given? Was she both? The courts answered the only question courts are designed to answer: guilty or not guilty. The deeper question, what responsibility a society bears for the human beings it produces, was never part of the proceedings. Aileen Wuornos was executed. Her story remains unresolved. That is exactly the point. Before we go any further, if you're new here, welcome to Daily Crime Archive. This channel exists because the most important cases in criminal history deserve more than a 2-minute recap. We go deep. We cover the background, the investigation, the courtroom, the aftermath, and the questions that don't have clean answers. No sponsors shaping what we say. No algorithm chasing outrage. Just the cases. Researched, contextualized, and told with the weight they deserve. If that's what you came here for, hit subscribe right now and turn on the bell. We're a new channel, and every subscriber genuinely matters. You being here is what makes this possible. Now, let's get into the remaining 9 cases that prove monsters don't always look like monsters.
It is further ordered that on such scheduled date that you be put to death.
Yes, I intend to complete my legal education and become a lawyer and be a damn good lawyer.
Take care of yourself, young man.
Thank you.
It's a tragedy for this court to see it's such a total waste, I think, of humanity that I've experienced in this court. You're a bright young man. You'd have made a good lawyer. I'd love to have you practice in front of me, but you went another way, partner.
Ted Bundy. If there is a single name that defines the concept of the serial killer in American cultural memory, it is Ted Bundy. Not because he had the highest body count, not because his methods were the most forensically complex, but because of the gap, the staggering, almost incomprehensible gap between the man that everyone around him saw and the man that he actually was. He was handsome. He was articulate. He volunteered at a crisis hotline, taking calls from people on the edge of ending their lives. He worked in politics. He studied law. He was the kind of young man that professors wanted to write recommendation letters for. and he was one of the most prolific and sadistic killers of the 20th century. Bundy's killing spree stretched through the 1970s across at least 7 states. He officially confessed to 30 murders. Investigators who spent years on his case believe the real number may have been significantly higher, possibly approaching 100. His victims were almost uniformly young women, often college students, and his method of approach was a masterclass in the weaponization of social trust. He would manufacture vulnerability, a fake cast on his arm, a fake injury that made him appear to need help. He would approach a woman, at a parking lot, at a park, at a campus, and ask for assistance with something completely ordinary. Carrying books, moving something to his car, finding a location. The moment a woman trusted him enough to walk with him toward his vehicle, the trap had already closed. He would render her unconscious, bind her, drive her to a location he had selected in advance, and there he would commit acts of violence that, even by the standards of the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, created in part because of cases like his, were considered extreme. He sexually assaulted his victims before and after death. He returned to crime scenes days, and sometimes weeks later. He decapitated some victims and kept the skulls. He told investigators, in his final pre-execution interviews, that these acts had been compulsive, ritual, and the source of something he described as satisfaction. The timeline of Bundy's crimes is long and accelerating. In January 1974, he broke into the basement apartment of University of Washington student Joni Lenz, bludgeoned her with a metal rod, and left her with permanent brain damage. She survived. She was not supposed to. Over the following months, young women began disappearing across Washington state, and then beyond Oregon, Utah, Colorado. The cases were not immediately connected. Different jurisdictions, different methods of initial approach, a killer who moved. In the summer of 1974, in broad daylight, at Lake Sammamish State Park, Bundy abducted 2 women within hours of each other. Witnesses saw a man with his arm in a sling. He had introduced himself by his first name. His actual first name. It was one of the first cracks in the facade. A composite was developed. Tip lines received thousands of calls, including by multiple accounts, calls identifying Bundy by name. Investigators looked at him. They looked at him more than once. And each time, his polish, his cooperativeness, his unnerving normalcy, helped him slide through. His arrest in 1975 came from a traffic stop in Utah, not from the murder investigations. A patrolman pulled him over late at night, under suspicious circumstances. Inside his Volkswagen Beetle, handcuffs, ski masks, rope, crowbars. The tools of exactly what he was. Even then, the full picture took time to assemble. Bundy escaped custody twice. The first time, in 1977, he jumped from a courthouse window in Colorado during a recess and was free for 6 days. The second time, later that year, he worked loose from a crawl space in his jail ceiling and simply walked out of the building. He was free for weeks before he was recaptured. In the period between his second escape and his recapture, Bundy committed what investigators consider his most brutal and compressed act of violence. On a January night in 1978, he entered the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. In the span of minutes, he attacked 4 women, bludgeoning and strangling with speed and efficiency. 2 of them died. 2 survived with severe injuries. He then moved to another location in the same city and attacked again the same night. Several weeks later, he abducted and murdered 12-year-old Kimberly Leach near Lake City, Florida. It was that crime that ultimately sealed his fate in the Florida courts. Bundy's trials became national spectacles. Cameras were allowed in the courtroom. Observers lined up. Women sent him letters, some declaring love, some proposing marriage. He acted as his own attorney. He made legal arguments that professors at law schools later discussed in class. He proposed to a woman on live television during his own trial. She accepted. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Witness testimony. Forensic analysis. His own behavior and statements. In 1979, he received a death sentence for the Chi Omega murders. A second death sentence followed for the murder of Kimberly Leach. For a decade, he sat on Florida's death row, engaging in a strategy of partial confessions, drip-feeding investigators details about additional victims, buying time, maintaining relevance, maintaining control over a situation in which he otherwise had none. Days before his execution, the confessions accelerated. He told interviewers he was addicted to violent pornography, which he blamed for fueling his fantasies. Investigators and victims' families viewed these final disclosures with complete skepticism. One more manipulation from a man who had never, in his entire life, done anything that wasn't tactical. On January 24, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed in Florida's electric chair. Outside the prison, a crowd had gathered. Vendors were selling T-shirts. People were cheering. It was, depending on your perspective, either a grotesque carnival atmosphere or the specific, cathartic response of a public that had lived with this man's shadow for 15 years. Before his death, Bundy said something that has been repeated in every documentary, every academic paper, every podcast discussion of his case ever since. We serial killers are your sons. We are your husbands. We are everywhere. He wanted that to be disturbing. He wanted people to carry it with them. He understood, even at the end, how to land a line. He was right, and he was wrong. He was right that the face of violence is often familiar. He was wrong, or perhaps simply unwilling to acknowledge, that most sons and husbands manage to move through the world without murdering anyone. Ted Bundy was not a product of inevitability. He was a series of choices, made by a person who had options, and who made those choices anyway.
I didn't ever want freedom. Frankly, I wanted death for myself.
What was he trying to do?
Like he was listening to my heart, because at a point he told me he was going to eat my heart at that point.
I know my time in prison will be terrible.
I don't want to ever see my mother have to go through this again. Never, Jeffrey! Jeffrey! I hate you, mother! I hate you!
I'm prepared for your sentence, which I know will be the maximum. I ask for no consideration.
Jeffrey Dahmer. In the summer of 1991, officers responding to a distress call in Milwaukee entered a small, unremarkable apartment on North 25th Street. The exterior was ordinary. The hallway smelled of something they couldn't immediately place. The door opened. What they found inside is documented in more than 1,000 pages of police reports, forensic analyses, and court testimony. It is among the most extensively cataloged crime scenes in American criminal history, and it is still, more than 3 decades later, considered one of the most disturbing discoveries in the history of American law enforcement. Jeffrey Dahmer was born in 1960 in Bath, Ohio, and raised in a household that neighbors and teachers would later describe as unremarkable. He was quiet. He was withdrawn. He had a childhood obsession with dead animals. He collected roadkill. He dissected things in a shed behind the house. He was curious about what things looked like on the inside. Teachers noticed he was odd. Nobody flagged him as dangerous. His teenage years were defined by isolation and, increasingly, by alcohol. While classmates planned for college and relationships and futures, Dahmer was drinking heavily and developing fantasies about control and domination that he would later describe to investigators with an unnerving calm. In 1978, months after graduating high school, Dahmer committed his first murder. He picked up an 18-year-old hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks, brought him home, gave him drinks. When Hicks tried to leave, Dahmer struck him with a barbell and strangled him. He dismembered the body, crushed the bones, and scattered them in the woods behind the house. Stephen Hicks vanished. Nobody connected his disappearance to the shy, unremarkable teenager who had been the last person to see him. For nearly a decade after Stephen Hicks, Dahmer held the impulse at bay, at least enough to avoid another killing. He enlisted in the army. He was discharged for alcohol abuse. He lived with his grandmother in Wisconsin, who noticed his strange hours and habits, but accepted his explanations. In 1987, the compulsion broke through again. At a Milwaukee hotel, he murdered a man named Stephen Tuomi. He kept the body for days before disposing of it. From 1987 to 1991, the pace never slowed again. He frequented gay bars and bathhouses in Milwaukee. He would offer men drinks, money, the promise of photographs, or just companionship. He would bring them back to his apartment. He would drug them, strangle them, and then do things with the bodies that investigators, experienced as they were, struggled to document without clinical detachment. He photographed everything. He engaged in necrophilia. He experimented with cannibalism. He told investigators that consuming parts of his victims felt, to him, like making them a permanent part of himself. He drilled holes into skulls while victims were still alive and injected acid, trying and failing, to create what he described as living, permanently compliant companions. He wanted someone who could never leave. Everyone died. He kept skulls. He kept bones. He kept hearts in the freezer. He maintained a refrigerator in that apartment on North 25th Street that he asked visitors not to open. The neighbors complained repeatedly about the smell. Dahmer told them it was spoiled meat. The case that ended it almost didn't end it. In May 1991, 2 months before Dahmer's arrest, a 14-year-old boy named Kohberger Synthesumphone escaped Dahmer's apartment. He was semi-conscious, bleeding, and unable to communicate coherently. Neighbors called 911. Officers responded. Dahmer arrived at the scene while the officers were there. He was calm. He was articulate. He told the officers that the boy was his 19-year-old boyfriend, that they had argued, that the boy had had too much to drink. He was cooperative. He answered every question without a tremor. The officers escorted Kohberger Synthesumphone back into Dahmer's apartment. They did not run Dahmer's name. They did not check the boy's age. They left. Hours later, Kohberger was dead. 2 months after that, on July 22, 1991, another intended victim, Tracy Edwards, managed to escape. He fled the apartment with one wrist still in handcuffs and flagged down a passing police vehicle. Officers entered the apartment on North 25th Street. The smell was the first thing. Then the photographs, Polaroids of dismembered bodies, arranged deliberately in various states. Then the refrigerator. Inside, a human head. Dahmer was in the apartment when officers arrived. He did not attempt to flee. He confessed to everything. He was cooperative, thorough, and disturbingly precise. He described all 17 murders. He described the acts that followed each one. He told investigators which victims he had consumed parts of, and explained his reasoning, not as justification, but as description. He wasn't angry in the interviews. He wasn't defensive. He talked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time, and was, in some complicated way, relieved to put it down. At his 1992 trial, the defense argued insanity. The argument was not without logic. The nature of the crimes, the acts, the internal architecture of what Dahmer had constructed inside that apartment seemed to many observers to be self-evidently the product of a broken mind. The jury found him legally sane, guilty on 15 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, nearly 1,000 years. He served 2 years. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer was beaten to death in a Wisconsin prison bathroom by a fellow inmate named Christopher Scarver. Scarver later said he had acted because of what Dahmer had done, and because Dahmer had allegedly taunted other inmates by fashioning his prison food into shapes resembling body parts. Jeffrey Dahmer was 34 years old. His case has been the subject of more academic papers, documentary films, and cultural analyses than almost any other in American criminal history. The 2022 Netflix series brought his name to an entirely new generation and sparked a significant, necessary conversation about the race and class dynamics of his victim selection and the repeated failures of law enforcement to take seriously the reports of the community members who lived near his apartment. Those are not peripheral questions. They are central to understanding how Dahmer operated for as long as he did. The monsters in these cases don't just find victims. They find environments that allow them to operate. Jeffrey Dahmer found one for 13 years. We're a few cases in, and I want to take a moment. If you're watching this and you've been here since the beginning, you know what this channel is trying to do. We're not interested in shock for its own sake. We're interested in understanding how these cases actually unfolded, the investigations, the failures, the systemic gaps that let these individuals operate for as long as they did. Daily Crime Archive is new. That means every view, every subscribe, every notification bell matters in a concrete way. YouTube's algorithm doesn't discover new channels on its own. You have to help it along. If you've watched this far and you're not subscribed, take 5 seconds right now. It makes a real difference for us. And drop a comment. Tell us which case from this list you're most familiar with, or which one is already hitting different than you expected. We read everything. 7 more cases to go. They don't get lighter.
It looked like it was a body, and they had no hand on it.
Anthony Sowell. In 2009, in a Cleveland neighborhood already bearing decades of disinvestment, a modest 2-story house on Imperial Avenue held the remains of 11 women. They had been there, some of them, for years. Anthony Sowell was born in 1959. His childhood, by his own account and the accounts of those who knew the family, was defined by a domestic violence so pervasive it shaped every subsequent relationship he had with other people. His mother was physically abusive. The environment was chaotic. By the time he was a young adult, the pattern was established. In 1989, Sowell committed a brutal rape, luring a woman, binding her, assaulting her for hours. He was convicted. He served 15 years. In 2005, he was released. He moved into a house on Imperial Avenue, a property left by his deceased stepmother. He got a job. He was registered, as required by law, as a sex offender. And then he started killing. His method was terrifyingly consistent in its exploitation of structural vulnerability. Sowell did not target strangers at random. He targeted women who were already struggling, women dealing with addiction, women experiencing homelessness, women who existed in the margins of the social systems that were supposed to catch people before they fell. He offered them something: food, alcohol, a warm place to sleep, something ordinary, something that would seem, to a woman who had very little, like a reasonable exchange. Once they were inside the house, he became something else entirely. He strangled them. Sometimes with a cord, sometimes with his hands. Sometimes the strangulation was followed by rape, sometimes it preceded it. When they were dead, he disposed of the bodies inside the structure of the house itself, in the crawl space under the floor, in rooms he kept closed, in the backyard soil. For years, the smell was overwhelming. Neighbors filed complaints. Multiple complaints. They attributed it to the sausage factory nearby, or to sewer problems, or to something unnameable. City officials came out, made notes, did nothing definitive. The women were missing. Their families had reported them missing. And because the victims were poor, and black, and struggling with addiction, the missing persons reports did not generate the investigative response they would have generated for a different demographic in a different neighborhood. That is not speculation. That is documented in the case records and in the subsequent investigative reviews. Sowell took advantage of exactly that indifference. He was confident, correctly for years, that no one would look closely enough. What ended it was a survivor. In September 2009, a woman named Latondra Billups escaped Sowell's house after he attempted to strangle her and went directly to police. Officers obtained a search warrant. On October 29, 2009, they entered Imperial Avenue. The smell was the first thing every investigator mentioned in their reports. Then the basement. Then the backyard. Then the crawl spaces and sealed rooms upstairs. The remains of 11 women were recovered. Some had been dead for years. Identification required DNA analysis and dental records. Their names: Crystal Dozier, Tashana Culver, LaShonda Long, Michelle Mason, Tonya Carmichael, Crystal Dozier, Imelda Hunter, Talasha Fortson, Tanya Carmichael, Kim Yvette Smith, Nancy Cobbs. 11 women, with names, with families, with histories, that did not begin and end on Imperial Avenue. At trial in 2011, Sowell showed no remorse and claimed his memory of the killings was impaired by drugs and alcohol. The prosecution's case was built on forensic evidence, survivor testimony, and the physical contents of the house itself. The jury convicted him on 82 charges, including multiple counts of aggravated murder, kidnapping, and rape. The recommended sentence was death. Anthony Sowell died in February 2021 in the Chillicothe Correctional Institution of a terminal illness before his scheduled execution. The city demolished the house on Imperial Avenue in 2011. The lot is empty now. But the questions the case raised about how 11 women can disappear from the same neighborhood over several years without triggering a serious investigative response have never been answered with the specificity they deserve.
She's fighting for her life, and I'm fighting for my pleasure.
Samuel Little. In 2018, the FBI made an announcement that received significant news coverage for approximately one news cycle before being swallowed by other events. The announcement was this: the deadliest confirmed serial killer in American history was not Ted Bundy. It was not John Wayne Gacy. It was not Jeffrey Dahmer. It was a man named Samuel Little, and he had been confirmed responsible for at least 93 murders, stretching across nearly 5 decades and at least 19 states. Most people have never heard of him. That fact is part of the story. Samuel Little was born in 1940 in Reynolds, Georgia, and raised primarily by his grandmother after a childhood defined by instability. He struggled in school. He bounced between family members. He began committing crimes, car theft, breaking and entering, in his early teens, and was in and out of juvenile detention. Violence and movement became the architecture of his life. By the 1960s, his crimes had escalated to robbery and assault. He was convicted. He served time. He was released. He committed more crimes. He served more time. But the pattern the criminal justice system kept catching and releasing him for was not his real pattern. His real pattern was this: he targeted women who existed at the margins of visibility. Sex workers, women living with addiction, women in poverty, women whose disappearances, he had correctly assessed, would not be treated by law enforcement as urgent. He would lure them. He would strangle them with his bare hands. He preferred strangulation for the level of control it provided, and he described the act to investigators with a specificity and a relish that disturbed even experienced interrogators. Because strangulation often leaves few external marks, and because his victims were often in communities where death could be attributed to overdose or exposure or unknown causes, coroners across multiple states ruled his killings as accidents, natural causes, or inconclusive. The bodies were closed cases before the investigations had really started. Law enforcement didn't catch Little for murder. They caught him for a drug charge in Kentucky in 2012, which led to his extradition to California for outstanding warrants. DNA evidence in Los Angeles then linked him to the unsolved murders of 3 women from the late 1980s: Carol Alford, Guadalupe Apodaca, and Audrey Nelson. All 3 had been strangled. All 3 cases had been officially unresolved for more than 20 years. He was tried and convicted in 2014. Sentenced to life without parole. For most killers, that's the end of the story. For Samuel Little, prison was the beginning of the revelation. In 2018, Texas Ranger James Holland began visiting Little in prison. Holland was a skilled interrogator, and he had a theory that the convictions in California were the visible edge of something much larger. He was right. Little began to talk. Slowly at first. Then in sustained, detailed accounts that covered decades and states and circumstances that investigators had never connected to each other because they had never been looking for connections. Little's memory was extraordinary. He remembered his victims, their approximate ages, their physical descriptions, the cities and neighborhoods where he had found them, the months and years. He was able to describe details of the scenes that matched cold case files that investigators had pulled from archives across the country. He also drew their portraits. From memory, with pencils and paper provided by the prison, Little produced haunting sketches of women he had killed. Portraits of women whose files had been stamped unsolved or natural causes, or simply closed for lack of evidence. Investigators compared those drawings to missing persons databases, to photographs and cold case files, to families who had been waiting for answers for 30-40 years. Match after match after match. The FBI spent years systematically verifying his confessions. They confirmed at least 60 murders. The full scope of what he described suggested a number in excess of 90. He was officially designated the most prolific serial killer in confirmed American history. Samuel Little died in December 2020 at Centinela State Prison in California. He was 80 years old. He never faced trial for the vast majority of his confirmed killings. Most of his victims have still not been identified. The FBI maintains an active page featuring his drawings, asking the public to help put names to the faces he sketched from memory. Each portrait represents a woman whose family may still not know what happened to her. Samuel Little's crimes force a specific, uncomfortable confrontation. They were possible because of a systematic devaluation of certain human lives. He chose his victims because he knew the system would not look hard for them. And for decades he was right. That is not just a statement about one killer. It is a statement about the infrastructure of crime and indifference that allowed him to move through America for 50 years.
Stupid, clumsy, slow, sloppy, weak, dirty. If you hadn't attacked them in their sleep, in the middle of the night, like a pedophile, Kaylee would have kicked your ass.
You're evil. There's no place for you in heaven. You are gonna suffer, man. I'm shaking because I want to reach out to you, but I hope you feel my energy, okay? Go to hell.
Bryan Kohberger. In November 2022, the murders of 4 college students in a small Idaho town ignited one of the most intense true crime investigations in recent memory. The case combined the elements that make the public fixate: young victims, a quiet community shattered, an investigation with almost no public information, and a suspect who, when he was finally identified, turned out to be studying the very thing he had allegedly committed. The victims were Ethan Chapin, Madison Mogan, Xana Kernodle, and Kaylee Goncalves, students at the University of Idaho, living off campus in a house in Moscow, Idaho. On the night of November 12th into the early hours of November 13th, 2022, they were killed inside that house. 2 other roommates were asleep in the building and survived. One of them, partially awakened by sounds she couldn't entirely process in the moment, saw a figure in the hallway. A man in dark clothing, wearing a mask. She locked herself in her room. She waited. By the time she fully understood what had happened, it was morning. The weapon was a large, fixed-blade knife. The attack was described by the coroner, one of the most experienced in Idaho, as among the most disturbing scenes she had witnessed in her career. The community of Moscow, Idaho, a quiet university town of around 25,000 people, was immediately and fundamentally changed. Students left campus in significant numbers. Residents who had never locked their doors in their adult lives installed new locks. The investigation generated global media attention, social media speculation on a scale rarely seen for a criminal case, and a months-long absence of public information from investigators that fed both legitimate inquiry and significant misinformation. Bryan Kohberger was arrested on December 30, 2022, at his parents' home in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. He was 28 years old. He was, at the time of his arrest, a PhD student in the Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology at Washington State University, located in Pullman, Washington, approximately 8 miles from Moscow, Idaho. He had been studying, academically, how crimes are committed and how criminals think. The evidence assembled against him was extensive. His DNA was found on a knife sheath left on one of the victims' beds. Surveillance footage captured his white Hyundai Elantra in the area of the house on the night of the murders, and in the surrounding neighborhood multiple times in the weeks preceding the attack, suggesting surveillance. Cell phone records placed him near the scene during the relevant time frame. Perhaps most damning, investigators documented that during the hours when the murders occurred, Kohberger's phone was off. Immediately after, as he drove away from the area, it was back on, illuminating his route home with timestamp precision. Former classmates and acquaintances, interviewed after his arrest, described him variously as intellectually intense, controlling in academic settings, obsessive about diet and physical fitness, and, perhaps most revealingly, fascinated by the psychology of why people commit crimes. Some of them had sat in seminars with him, discussing criminal profiling, and the forensic investigation of homicides, the same forensic techniques that were being used to track him. The case moved through prolonged pre-trial proceedings. The scope of the evidence, the volume of discovery material, and the legal complexity of a case that crossed state lines and involved extensive digital forensics extended the timeline significantly. In July 2025, Bryan Kohberger entered a plea agreement. He admitted to all 4 murders. He received 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. By pleading guilty, he avoided the death penalty, a fact that produced fierce and public anger from the victims' families. Kaylee Goncalves' family made their feelings about the outcome unambiguous. They had wanted a trial. They had wanted every piece of evidence laid out in a public proceeding. They had wanted a death sentence. What they received instead was a man who would live out his natural life in a prison cell, at the cost of avoiding the full public exposure of what he had done and why. The question of motive, the core question of why, was never fully answered in the public record. There are investigative theories, but Kohberger himself has not provided an explanation that has been made public. A connection to one of the victims through social media was alleged but not adjudicated. What we know is that 4 people died on a November night in Idaho because someone who studied how killers think decided to become one, and then thought he could think his way out of being caught. He was wrong. We are more than halfway through this one, and I want to check in with you directly. If you have been watching this channel for a while, thank you. Genuinely. Every comment, every share, every time someone sends this to a friend, that's how Daily Crime Archive grows. If you're newer here, welcome. This is what we do. Long-form, researched, contextualized coverage of cases that deserve more than a headline. We're building something, and we need your help to build it faster. Hit subscribe. Hit the bell. And when this episode is over, check the pinned comment. We put together a full reference list with current status on every case we cover, because we know that's what people actually want. 4 more cases left. Each one different. Each one carrying its own specific weight. Let's keep going.
To entertain the children there. And we didn't entertain them with handcuffs or anything like that. All we used,
John Wayne Gacy. He threw neighborhood parties. He was a precinct captain for the Democratic Party in Chicago. He was photographed with political figures. He volunteered at children's hospitals, at charity events, at community fundraisers, dressed as a character he called Pogo the Clown. He had 33 bodies in and around his house. John Wayne Gacy was born in Chicago in 1942. His relationship with his father was defined by contempt. His father was alcoholic, verbally and physically abusive, and communicated to Gacy across his entire childhood that he was weak, disappointing, and insufficient. That specific wound, the desperate, unfulfilled need for male approval and respect, ran through everything that followed. He married in his 20s. He ran a business. He became community involved. He managed, for a period, to build the surface of a respectable life in suburban Chicago. But in 1968, he was convicted in Iowa of sexually assaulting a 15-year-old boy. He served less than 2 years. He was released. Back in Chicago, he reconstructed the surface again. The business, the community involvement, the parties, the clown performances at hospitals and fundraisers, the political connections, and he began killing. Gacy's targets were almost uniformly teenage boys and young men, many of them runaways, many of them lured with job offers through his contracting company, PDM Contractors. He needed labor. He paid well. The boys came to his door. His method of establishing control was a trick he used repeatedly. He would produce handcuffs and present them as part of a magic act. He would convince his victim to try them on. Once restrained, the encounter changed entirely. He would assault them, torture them for hours, and then strangle them. He buried most of them in the crawl space beneath his house. When that space was full, he began disposing of bodies in the Des Plaines River. For years, neighbors complained about the smell from his property. He had explanations for everything. For years, boys went missing, and their disappearances were classified as runaway cases. Their families begged for investigations that didn't come with urgency. Gacy attended political fundraisers. He posed for photographs. The unraveling began in December 1978, when 15-year-old Robert Peace told his mother he was going to speak with a contractor about a potential job, and did not come home. The contractor's name was John Wayne Gacy. Police obtained a search warrant for his property. What investigators found in the crawl space beneath the house required days to fully excavate. 29 young men and boys, buried in the soil beneath the floor of a suburban Chicago home. 4 more were found in the river. 33 total. It was, at the time, the highest confirmed body count for a single American serial killer. Gacy's arrest became a national story immediately. The contrast, the clown, the community figure, the party host, the political volunteer, and the crawl space was precisely the kind of cognitive dissonance that burns itself into cultural memory. At his 1980 trial, Gacy claimed that an alternate personality named Jack had committed the murders. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before finding him guilty on all 33 counts. He was sentenced to death. For 14 years, Gacy sat on Illinois' death row. He painted portraits of clowns primarily. The paintings sold. Collectors paid significant sums for artwork created by a man who had buried 33 people in his home. That is its own disturbing footnote. He gave interviews. He alternated between claiming innocence, blaming others, and making statements of such startling arrogance that they became famous in their own right. In one of the most quoted moments of his time on death row, he declared, "I should never have been convicted of anything more serious than running a cemetery without a license." On May 10, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center. He was 52 years old. After his death, his brain was removed and preserved for scientific study. Researchers hoped to identify some neurological anomaly, some biological marker that would explain what he had done. Nothing definitively unusual was found.
I think most humans have in them the capacity to commit murder. It is not because...
No, we don't, Richard.
They choose not to, not because they are morally superior, as they so commonly claim, but because they are imprisoned in a web of responsibilities, commitments, beliefs, and sentiments, and that would render murder an absurd gamble or ridiculous self-destruction.
Richard Ramirez. In the summer of 1985, the city of Los Angeles was afraid of the dark. Not metaphorically. People were literally afraid to sleep in their own homes with the windows open. Gun sales in Los Angeles County spiked sharply over a period of months. Neighborhood watch groups formed, disbanded, reformed. People who had never owned a deadbolt paid to have them installed. The source of this fear was a man who had been given a name by the press, the Night Stalker. His real name was Richard Ramirez, and he was unlike almost every other killer on this list in one specific, terrifying way. He had no consistent type, no predictable method, no identifiable pattern beyond the fact that he broke into homes at night and he used whatever was available. Ramirez was born in 1960 in El Paso, Texas. His childhood was shaped by poverty and violence. His father was prone to explosive anger. His early influences included a cousin named Miguel, a Vietnam veteran who showed the young Ramirez photographs from the war, photographs of women Miguel claimed to have raped and killed. When Ramirez was 13, he witnessed Miguel shoot his wife in the face during a domestic dispute. By his late teens, Ramirez was heavily involved in drugs and had developed an obsession with Satanism, not as a philosophical framework, but as an ideological permission structure. He believed the devil guided him. He incorporated what he described as ritual elements into his crimes. Victims reported him forcing them to make satanic declarations. He scratched pentagrams into surfaces at crime scenes. By the time he arrived in California as a young adult, he was, in terms of what he would do, already formed. Between June 1984 and August 1985, Ramirez attacked at least 16 times, killing 13 people and wounding others. His victims ranged from a 79-year-old woman to a 9-year-old girl. He shot people. He stabbed people. He beat people with hammers. He broke into homes where couples were sleeping and attacked both occupants. He abducted children. The randomness was the terror. With most serial killers, investigators can build a profile, a victim type, a geographic pattern, a method signature that eventually narrows the search. With Ramirez, every time they thought they understood the parameters, he did something that fell outside them. He wore gloves sometimes and left no prints. Other times he left shoe impressions, a specific Avia sneaker, it turned out, that investigators eventually traced, and that became a key piece of physical evidence. By the summer of 1985, his name, the Night Stalker, was in every newspaper in Southern California. People knew what he looked like from composite sketches. But the sketches weren't enough. A turning point came in August 1985, when Ramirez made a mistake. He abducted 2 young sisters, assaulted them, and then, uncharacteristically, released them. One of them survived with enough recollection to assist investigators, and separately a fingerprint was recovered from a stolen car he had abandoned. The print matched Richard Ramirez, a drifter with an extensive arrest record who had no previous murder convictions. Investigators ran his mugshot in the media. Days later, Ramirez was recognized on the street in East Los Angeles. He tried to run. Residents pursued him on foot, beat him with pipes, and held him down until police arrived. The city that had spent the summer paralyzed with fear had caught its monster in the streets, with its own hands. His trial in 1989 was a spectacle that Ramirez appeared to enjoy. He showed no remorse. He made satanic gestures at the jury. He smirked. He flashed a pentagram he had scratched into his palm. He cultivated a following of women who sent him letters and photographs and declarations of love, one of whom he eventually married while on death row. He was convicted of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. He was sentenced to death. He told reporters, "Big deal. Death always comes with the territory. See you in Disneyland." Richard Ramirez spent the next 23 years on death row at San Quentin State Prison, where he died of complications from lymphoma in June 2013. He was 53 years old. His execution date had never arrived. The Night Stalker taught a specific lesson to the investigators who came after him. That profile-based approaches to serial crime have limits. That some killers deliberately avoid consistency as a form of operational security. And that fear, real, pervasive, city-scale fear, is itself a tool that certain killers are aware they are deploying. Andrei Chikatilo. In the Soviet Union of the 1970s and 1980s, a government that controlled its own information apparatus had a significant problem. A serial killer of extraordinary brutality was operating across its southern regions, and acknowledging his existence would require acknowledging a failure that the official ideology of Soviet society had no framework for. The result was that Andrei Chikatilo, the butcher of Rostov, was able to operate for over a decade with the protection of systemic denial. He killed at least 52 people. Some estimates are higher. Chikatilo was born in 1936 in Ukraine under Stalinist rule during a period of mass famine. His family whispered of a brother who had been killed and cannibalized during the Holodomor. Whether this is true is historically unclear, but the family believed it, and Chikatilo grew up in the shadow of that story. His father was taken prisoner during World War II. He grew up under his mother's rigid control, in a household defined by poverty and shame. He experienced chronic impotence throughout his adult life, a condition he described as a source of profound humiliation that shaped his entire psychology. He married, had children, and functioned publicly as a teacher and later a supply clerk. He was unremarkable on the surface. Beneath it, he had been committing acts of sexual misconduct against children for years. Early incidents were reported and dismissed. Soviet authorities treated such matters as internal embarrassments, not criminal patterns worth sustained investigation. His first confirmed murder came in 1978. He lured a 9-year-old girl, Yelena Zakotnova, to a shed and attempted to assault her. When he could not, the encounter turned to frenzied violence. He stabbed her repeatedly and threw her body in a river. Another man was arrested, convicted, and executed for the crime. Chikatilo continued. Through the 1980s, the pattern was relentless. He targeted runaways, young boys, teenage girls, and vulnerable women near bus stations and train depots across the Rostov Oblast. He would approach them with promises of food, work, or assistance, led them to wooded or remote areas, and then attack with a knife in a frenzy that investigators described as unlike anything they had documented. The mutilations were severe. Organs were removed. Eyes were targeted with specific frequency, a detail that psychiatric experts later tied to Chikatilo's belief that the eyes retained a visual impression of the killer. Bodies were left in states of such extreme violation that experienced forensic investigators filed reports using clinical language that still communicated revulsion. The Soviet investigative apparatus struggled with the case for multiple reasons. The government was reluctant to admit publicly that a serial killer was operating. The concept of serial murder was ideologically associated with capitalism and social decay, not Soviet society. Cases were pressured to close quickly. Innocent men were arrested. At least one was executed. Chikatilo operated within that bureaucratic protection for over a decade. The breakthrough came in 1990. Undercover officers watching train stations in the area observed Chikatilo approaching potential victims. They detained him and found a knife and rope in his bag. After days of interrogation, during which he initially provided nothing, he broke. He confessed to the killings. In a sequence of increasingly detailed admissions, he described each victim, each location, each act. He explained, with a clinical precision that stunned his interrogators, why the killings provided him with the sexual satisfaction that ordinary sexual interaction never had. He expressed no remorse and displayed no distress. His 1992 trial took place behind the reinforced glass of a steel cage, installed to protect him from the families of victims who packed the courtroom. He shouted, ranted, sang Ukrainian folk songs, and periodically exposed himself. The families screamed back. It was a proceeding that bore little resemblance to the measured legal proceedings of Western courts, and was, by most accounts, exactly what everyone in that courtroom needed it to be, an opportunity to confront the thing that had taken their children. He was convicted of 52 murders and sentenced to death. On February 14, 1994, Andrei Chikatilo was executed by a single gunshot to the back of the head. The judge at sentencing had told him, "This monster is not a man. He deserves to be executed." The courtroom applauded.
O meu pai matou minha mãe por quê? E minha mãe tinha traído ele. Mentira, minha mãe era da questão do Brasil. Lá fora os vizinhos recolheram. Mas ele ia matar todo mundo. Pra matar na cadeia, não foi na rua, eu tava preso já. Eu fiquei 42 anos preso.
Pedro Rodrigues Filho. The final case on this list is different in structure from all the others. It comes from Brazil, not the United States. The criminal justice context is different. The cultural context is different. The numbers involved are different. And the figure at the center of it, Pedro Rodrigues Filho, known as Pedrinho Matador, or Little Pedro the Killer, described himself not as a monster but as a vigilante, a man who killed the people, who deserved to be killed. The reality was considerably more complicated. Pedro Rodrigues Filho was born in 1954. The violence that defined his life began before he was born, in a literal sense. His father, in a fit of rage, kicked his pregnant mother hard enough to cause a permanent injury. The child in her womb, Pedro, was affected before he drew a first breath. His childhood was defined by a violent home, poverty, and an early, formative fixation on punishment. He was not a passive child who absorbed cruelty. He processed it and externalized it. At 14, he committed his first murder. The deputy mayor of his town had fired his father, accusing him of stealing food from a school kitchen. Pedro believed his father was innocent. He obtained a shotgun, waited outside City Hall, and killed the deputy mayor. Hours later, he tracked down the man he believed had actually committed the theft that his father was blamed for, and killed him as well. He was 14. By 18, his reputation in the region was established. He moved to Sao Paulo. He fell into a relationship with a woman named Maria Olympia, and by his own account, experienced something like stability for the first time. When Maria was murdered by criminals, Pedro's response was the only one available to him within the framework he had built. He hunted down the people responsible and killed them. From that point, killing was the center of his operational life. In 1973, he was arrested. Prison did not stop him. It provided him with new victims. He developed within the prison system an articulated philosophy of vigilante justice. He killed men he had decided were rapists, gang members, or child abusers. He described himself as a man who only killed the guilty. But the accounts of his prison years also include violence that bore no relationship to any vigilante framework. Stabbings, attacks, and acts of gratuitous brutality that served no punitive purpose beyond the act itself. He carved words into bodies. He bragged about his kills. He kept count. The most extreme documented act of his prison years was against his own father. Pedro had learned, while incarcerated, that his father had murdered his mother with a machete. He waited for a prison visit. When his father arrived, Pedro ambushed him, stabbing him 22 times. Then he cut out a portion of his father's heart, put it in his mouth, chewed it, and spat it on the floor. He later described this as justice. By the time Brazilian courts had tallied everything, Pedro Rodrigues Filho had been convicted of 71 murders. Investigators believe the actual number exceeded 100. His accumulated sentences totaled more than 400 years. Brazil's criminal code at the time capped actual imprisonment at 30 years, regardless of total sentences. Pedro served 34 years, a modest extension above the legal cap, and in 2007 was released. He embraced public life in a way no one expected. He started a YouTube channel. He told stories about his past. He offered commentary on crime and violence in Brazil. He described himself as reformed. The channel attracted thousands of subscribers. Viewers arrived out of fascination, horror, or some combination of both. Some saw it as disturbing, a man who had killed more than 70 people turning his crimes into content. Others saw it as an unusual but arguably constructive engagement with a man who had been, in the most literal sense, shaped by the violence that surrounded him. In March 2023, gunmen ambushed Pedro Rodrigues Filho outside his home in Mogi das Cruzes, São Paulo. He was shot multiple times. He died at the scene. His murder remains unsolved. The man who had killed in the name of his own code of justice died as a victim of someone else's. Whether that represents irony, inevitability, or simply the logic of the world he had always lived in, is a question that doesn't resolve cleanly. 10 cases. Wuornos, Bundy, Dahmer, Sowell, Little, Kohberger, Gacy, Ramirez, Chikatilo, Filho. Different countries, different decades, different victim selections, different forensic signatures, different courtroom behaviors, different endings. But the thread connecting all of them, the one thing that runs through every single case on this list, is the gap. The gap between what was visible and what was real. The gap between what the people around them knew and what was actually happening. The gap between the surface and the interior. Bundy got letters. Gacy got photographed with politicians. Dahmer's neighbors accepted his explanations for the smell. Sowell's victims' disappearances were filed and largely left unfollowed. Little moved across 19 states for 50 years because he correctly identified which lives the system would treat as expendable. The lesson, if there is a lesson, is not that evil is everywhere or that every ordinary-seeming person is hiding something. Most aren't. The lesson is about what we look for and what we decide not to look for. The cases where investigators, neighbors, or systems intervened earlier than they might have, where someone looked past the surface, produced less destruction. The cases where the surface was accepted without examination produced decades of bodies. We look at these 10 individuals, and we search for the thing that marks them as fundamentally different, fundamentally other. The monster we can identify and quarantine. And sometimes, the disturbing truth is that the marker wasn't visible from outside. The Night Stalker looked like a thin, disheveled young man. The killer clown, looked like a respected community leader. The Milwaukee cannibal looked like a quiet neighbor who kept odd hours. They were all of those things, and they were also what they were. That tension between the ordinary and the monstrous is why these cases stay with us. Not because they offer easy answers, but because they don't. That is the full list. 10 cases. 100 minutes. If you made it to the end of this one, thank you. Genuinely. Content like this takes time to build properly, and the fact that you stayed means the channel is doing what it's supposed to do. Daily Crime Archive is new. That means your subscribe, your share, your comment in the section below carries actual weight in how YouTube's algorithm treats us. If you've been watching and haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. Drop a comment and tell us, which case from this list did you already know in detail? Which one completely changed what you thought you knew? And which one do you want us to go deeper on in a future episode? We read everything. Your input shapes what we cover. We'll see you in the next one.